It started as just another day, another high-profile event, another crowd, another moment in the public eye. Donald Trump, surrounded by his usual entourage, stepped out onto the bustling streets of New York City. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and security kept a tight perimeter. But then, something unexpected happened. Among the chaos, a frail homeless man sat on the sidewalk, wrapped in layers of tattered blankets. His face was weathered, his eyes filled with years of struggle. Most people hurried past, barely noticing him. But Trump stopped. Not for a handshake, not for a photo op, just stopped. For a moment, everything else seemed to fade. The energy in the air shifted. Onlookers whispered, phones went up to record. What was he doing? Why was he standing there? Even his security detail exchanged uncertain glances. Then, in a move that no one could have predicted, Trump took a step closer. The homeless man looked up, his expression unreadable. Was it disbelief, hope, fear? Whatever it was, the moment felt charged, like something big was about to happen. The cameras zoomed in. Every reporter in the area suddenly realized they were witnessing something different, something that wasn't in the script. Then, without warning, Trump did something that left the entire crowd speechless. No one saw it coming. Even those who thought they knew everything about him couldn't have anticipated what happened next. And in that moment, whether you love him or hate him, one thing was clear. This was a side of Trump few had ever seen before. For a brief second, everything seemed to pause. The city noise faded into the background, the flashing cameras, the murmurs, the ever-present rush of New York streets. All of it blurred. Trump stood there, his expression unreadable, his eyes locked onto the man sitting before him. The homeless man, wrapped in layers of worn-out fabric, didn't flinch. He didn't beg or reach out. He just stared back, as if trying to understand what was happening. The security team hesitated, their stance tense. This wasn't on the agenda. No one had briefed them for this kind of moment. The reporters, sensing something unusual, leaned in, ready to capture every detail. The homeless man's face, lined with hardship and time, held a story no one in the crowd knew. Who was he? How had he ended up here, on this cold stretch of pavement, invisible to the world until now? Trump finally spoke, his voice lower than usual, not the booming tone the public was used to. The words weren't clear at first, drowned out by the noise of traffic and the hushed murmurs from the crowd. But whatever he said made the homeless man's eyes widen, just slightly. It was enough for the tension in the air to tighten. A few people in the crowd exchanged glances. Was this just another moment for the cameras, or was something else at play? Some of them have followed Trump for years, covering his rallies, his speeches, his controversies, but this was different. It didn't fit into the usual script. The homeless man shifted, as if unsure of what to say. His hands, rough and calloused, gripped the edge of his blanket. His lips parted, but then he hesitated, glancing at the phone's recording, the faces watching. Whatever was happening between these two men, one of the most powerful figures in the country, and someone who had seemingly lost everything, wasn't over yet. And what happened next would be something no one could have prepared for. A gust of wind swept through the street, rustling the man's tattered blanket. Trump remained still, eyes locked on him, while the world around them watched, waiting for something, anything, to explain what was unfolding. The homeless man, his breath visible in the cold air, looked uncertain, as if he wasn't sure whether to speak or stay silent. Then, Trump did something no one expected. He crouched down slightly, bringing himself closer to the man's level. The cameras zoomed in. The murmurs grew louder. Was this a publicity stunt? Was there a deeper reason behind this? No one knew, but the energy in the air was undeniable. One of Trump's aides stepped forward, clearly uneasy. "Mr. President," he started, but Trump raised a hand, cutting him off. The aide fell silent. The homeless man finally found his voice, rough and cracked from years of hardship. "You don't remember me, do you?" he asked, his tone carrying something heavy, something personal. A flicker of something crossed Trump's face, a moment of recognition, a memory just out of reach. The people closest to the scene could feel the shift. This wasn't just an encounter with a stranger, there was history here. The man let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "I didn't think you would. Been a long time." The crowd was growing, more bystanders pulling out their phones, whispering among themselves. Reporters scribbled frantically in their notepads, some already typing up breaking news headlines. Trump studied the man, his brows furrowing slightly. The way he looked at him now was different, not with the usual distance of a politician shaking hands in a crowd, but with something else, something searching. "Who are you?" Trump finally asked. The man hesitated, as if deciding whether to answer. His fingers curled into his blanket, gripping it tight. Then he exhaled slowly. "You knew me before everything fell apart," he said. "Before all of this." The weight of his words settled over the crowd, and in that moment, the question wasn't just who this man was, but what his connection to Trump really meant. Trump's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible, but noticeable to those paying attention. The man in front of him wasn't just another face in the crowd. There was history between them, buried somewhere in the past. But where? When? The homeless man's eyes searched Trump's face, waiting for something. A flicker of recognition, a reaction, anything to show that the memory was still in there somewhere. The crowd around them was silent now, hanging on to every second, waiting to see what would happen next. "I used to work for you," the man finally said, his voice steady but tinged with something raw. "A long time ago." A ripple went through the crowd. Some people exchanged glances, while reporters scribbled faster, their minds already racing with possible headlines. Trump's brow furrowed slightly. He was known for having a sharp memory when it came to business, but this was unexpected. The man pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders, his fingers trembling, not just from the cold, but from something deeper. "I wasn't always like this," he continued. "I had a life, a family, a future." And then he trailed off, shaking his head. Everything changed. Trump studied him closely now, his mind working through the possibilities. He had met thousands, millions of people over the years. Employees, executives, partners, competitors. But something about this man's voice, the way he spoke, triggered something distant. "What happened?" Trump asked, his voice lower now, almost cautious. The man exhaled sharply, his breath misting in the cold air. "I lost everything," he said, "and I tried to reach out. I tried to fix it, but no one was listening." The tension in the air was thick, unshakable. Every person in the crowd felt it. The weight of the moment, the unspoken questions. Who was this man to Trump? And what had happened between them that led to this? Trump didn't look away. For the first time, he seemed to be seeing the man, not just as another struggling soul on the street, but as someone who had once been part of his world. And then, just when it seemed like the story couldn't take another turn, the man said something that changed everything. "You had the power to stop it," he whispered, "but you didn't." For a moment, everything stood still. The weight of the man's words hung between them, thick and undeniable. The crowd, the cameras, the world watching, none of it seemed to matter in that instant. Trump's gaze remained locked on the man, his face unreadable. But something had shifted. This wasn't just a chance encounter anymore. This was personal. Trump opened his mouth as if to say something, but then the man spoke again, his voice stronger now, more certain. "You don't remember, do you?" His eyes darkened, a mix of frustration and something else, something deeper. "I was one of your guys, one of the ones who gave everything. And then when things fell apart, I waited for a call that never came." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people leaned in closer, whispering among themselves. Reporters exchanged glances, sensing something much bigger than they had expected. This wasn't just about a man who had fallen on hard times. This was about something that had happened in Trump's past, something unresolved. Then, the man reached into his pocket. A few gasps escaped the crowd, and security instinctively stepped forward, but he didn't pull out anything threatening. Instead, he slowly unfolded a crumpled, yellowed piece of paper. He held it up for Trump to see. Trump's eyes flickered to it, and for the first time, his expression cracked, just slightly, but enough for those watching closely to notice. He recognized it. "You sent this," the man said. His voice was steady, but his hand trembled slightly. "Years ago, you probably forgot, but I didn't." The crowd strained to see what was written, but the paper remained between the two men. Whatever it was, it mattered. A lot. Trump took a step forward, his usual confidence momentarily replaced with something more cautious. "Where'd you get that?" he asked, his voice lower now. The man let out a short, dry laugh. "I didn't get it," he said. "I kept it. Through everything. And now I want to hear you say it. Right here, right now." The tension in the air was suffocating. The cameras zoomed in. The crowd held its breath. And for the first time, it wasn't clear who had the upper hand in this conversation. Trump's eyes stayed fixed on the paper. The weight of the moment was heavy, pressing in from all sides. The crowd, the cameras, the endless whispers, none of it mattered right now. This was between him and the man in front of him. A man he once knew. A man he had forgotten. Slowly, cautiously, Trump reached out and took the paper. His fingers brushed against the worn edges, and as he unfolded it, his expression shifted. Recognition. The silence deepened, and even the press seemed to hesitate, waiting for what would come next. Trump read the words, his lips moving slightly but making no sound. The paper was old, the ink slightly faded, but the message was clear. His own handwriting stared back at him. It was a letter, one he had written years ago, promising something, assuring someone of a future that never came. His signature was there at the bottom, bold and unmistakable. The homeless man's voice cut through the silence. "I believed you." His tone wasn't angry, but there was pain in it. "I held onto this, thinking maybe one day you'd remember. That maybe I mattered." Trump exhaled, his grip on the paper tightening. "What happened?" he asked, his voice lower, almost softer. The man shook his head. "I did everything right. I worked hard. I followed every rule. And when things went bad, I reached out. I waited." He motioned toward the letter. "This was all I had left. A promise from a man who never looked back." The tension in the air was thick, almost unbearable. Trump was rarely caught off guard, but in this moment, something was different. He wasn't just facing an old letter. He was facing a version of himself he had long since moved past. Then came the twist no one saw coming. The homeless man sighed, rubbing his temple, as if debating whether to say what came next. Finally, he looked Trump in the eye and said, "But you didn't forget me, did you?" Trump's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" The man leaned in slightly. "You knew who I was the second you saw me." A hush fell over the crowd. The realization hit like a shockwave. Had Trump recognized him all along? Had he known the truth but chosen not to say it? The cameras zoomed in closer, capturing every flicker of expression. Trump didn't answer right away. He looked at the man, then at the letter, then back again. Then, with a slow nod, he handed the paper back. "I remember," he finally admitted. And just like that, the story took a turn no one had expected. The homeless man held Trump's gaze, searching his face for something. An apology, regret, maybe just the truth. But Trump didn't look away. There was no denying it now. He had remembered from the start. He just hadn't known what to do about it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the city crept back in, honking cars, distant chatter, the shuffle of shoes against the pavement. The cameras were still rolling, reporters waiting for one last twist, one final dramatic moment. But instead of saying more, Trump did something unexpected. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a pen. Without hesitation, he flipped the letter over and began to write. The homeless man watched, his expression unreadable. When Trump finished, he handed the paper back. "No more waiting," Trump said, his tone firm. "This time, I mean it." The man hesitated before taking the paper. He looked down at the fresh ink, his eyes scanning the words. Whatever Trump had written, it was enough to make his shoulders relax, just slightly. He let out a breath, one that seemed like he'd been holding on to for years. The crowd remained silent, unsure of what had just happened. Some expected a grand gesture, a dramatic ending. But life wasn't always like that. Sometimes, closure wasn't about big speeches or sudden transformations. Sometimes, it was just about being seen, about finally being heard. Trump gave the man one last look, then turned to leave. His security team quickly fell in line, the cameras followed, and the city moved on. The homeless man stood there for a long time, staring at the letter in his hands. The words on the page were simple, but they meant everything. It wasn't about charity, it wasn't about publicity. It was about a moment, two lives reconnecting in a way no one could have predicted. And as the world kept turning, as the story spread, one thing was clear. Some encounters aren't accidents. Some moments, no matter how unexpected, are meant to happen.